Hello and welcome to Breakfast for Pancakes. I am your host, PK Sullivan. This week we go on the second journey of the Grand BreAdventure. The Grand BreAdventure is my series on how to make bread, starting from the very basics, learning to work with and manipulate the dough and the recipe, then gradually changing things, making them more complicated and getting into different kinds of bread. As promised, the first few videos in the series are all going to use the same recipe, down to the gram. So for this recipe, we're going to use the exact same measurements of water, flour, and salt, and we're going to make a different kind of bread than we made last time. The first bread that we made was a super simple, hearty, crusty, rustic loaf. It was generally unshaped, and once it came out of the oven, it had a real thick, hearty crust to it. So what we've got here is what I like to call one of my twin loaves. This recipe, this set of measurements for making bread, makes a big loaf of bread. Splitting it in two and baking it in a pair of loaf pans gives us a much different kind of bread. The crust on this is much softer. The crumb is even a little finer and more tightly compact than the original loaf. It has a very different shape, and the way we're going to achieve this is just by treating the dough and the ingredients differently. Same ingredients, different process, different bread. All right, stick around, we're about to get started. This recipe follows the same three basic steps that I laid out in the first one. We're going to have our starter phase, our sponge phase, and our dough phase, where we actually shape and bake the loaves. Just like last time, you can make a starter from scratch if you need to. Recipe for that is in the previous video. But if you held on to your starter, all you need to do is feed it. And it takes about the same amount of time for it to be active and bubbly, somewhere between 4 and 12 hours. To feed a starter just means to give it more water and flour so that it can propagate and activate the yeast. This recipe calls for 150 grams of starter, so we're going to add 150 grams of water and flour in total. The simplest way to do that is just split it in half, add equal amounts of water and flour to your starter. In this case would be 75 grams of water, 75 grams of all-purpose flour. But if you wanted to be really strict and maintain the exact same ratio, do 100 grams of water and 50 grams of flour. I do the 50-50 mix because it's simple and I haven't had any issues. I don't believe that there is going to be enough water transfer to the sponge and into the dough to really make a significant difference in the final product. I have made this recipe starting from scratch with a new starter, and with my continued starter over time, they turn out the same. One last thing, you're never going to get your 150 grams of starter completely cleanly. There will always be bits left over, stuck to your rubber scraper or in a bowl, something like that. So every 4 or 5 times, I bump it up to feeding it 200 grams total, and away we go from there. To feed your starter, measure out 75 grams of warm water into a bowl. The water should be between 110 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit. This will wake up the yeast and get the party started. To this, add all of the starter you reserved from a previous bake. Whisk until it is thoroughly combined. The ratio of water to flour at this point should give you more of a slurry than a paste. Things should be very liquid. Set that aside and measure out 75 grams of all-purpose flour. Now mix that into the liquid until everything is combined and no dry spots remain. Cover your starter loosely and let it do its job for 4 to 12 hours, or until bubbly and active. Overnight is a good time to do this so you can get to making the sponge first thing in the morning. Once your starter has propagated and is nice and bubbly, measure out and mix the ingredients for your sponge. It's always best to measure everything in individual vessels and combine the measured ingredients rather than measuring additions. Just like last time, the sponge needs 236 grams of warm water and 150 grams of starter. Whisk those together and set aside. Measure out 350 grams of bread flour. Then pour in the water starter mix and stir it all together until no dry spots remain. Loosely cover and let sit at room temperature for 4 to 5 hours. On to the dough phase. The rest has hydrated all the flour we've added so far. Now it's ready for more. Measure out 250 grams of bread flour and 7.5 grams of salt. Add the sponge to the bowl of your stand mixer, followed by the flour and salt. Attach the dough hook and mix the ingredients on low speed until the dough's appearance goes from shaggy to smooth. This batch took about 5 minutes. When kneading bread in a mixer, it's important to use low power settings so as to not overwork it. If you overwork the dough, it won't rise again and becomes tough in texture as the gluten strands break. Not what we want. I haven't over-kneaded dough yet, so maybe I'll do an instructional video on it sometime. For science! When your dough is soft and silky, remove it from the bowl and weigh it. We're making twin loaves, so cut the dough into halves, as equal as you can get them. I got mine to within 1.5 grams of each other. Now knead the dough by hand to create balls. Try for the smoothest ball possible, with the fewest cracks and crags you can manage. I am still learning this skill, my balls aren't perfect. Transfer your balls to greased bowls and cover with greased plastic wrap. A quick spritz of cooking spray works just fine for greasing. Let these proof at room temperature for 1 hour. Alright, quick interruption here just to talk about equipment and why we're doing what we're doing. You don't need to use loaf pans for this. You can make this as a more rustic log-shaped roll. In order to bake it that way, it really helps to have a baking stone. For this recipe, I wanted to stick with something more people will probably have, and that's a loaf pan. Loaf pans are small metal or glass containers that are generally pretty uniformly sized. It's great for making loaves of bread, yes, but it's also great for making meatloaf. And if you are into sort of like the banana bread, zucchini bread scene, a loaf pan is the best way to make those. These were pretty cheap. They were like $10 each. Ordered them online. They're from Nordicware. They are aluminum. I love these. I have some glass ones, but I don't like those because glass is really a good insulator and it takes a long time to heat up. So as much as these loaves are pale on the edges and whatnot where they were in contact with the metal, the glass pan is even more. You don't need to use loaf pans. I found that it was helpful to get the right shape, the right size, but in the end, work with what you have or what you want to work with. The other thing to note is after you've kneaded the dough and let it rest, the more you work with that dough, the more gas you're going to expel and the less it's going to rise. Trying to handle it as little as possible. The other big thing that I learned while I was developing this recipe is the effect of temperature on your bread. The ability for bread to rise really is dramatically improved if your kitchen is above 70 degrees. I live in Chicago. It has been a long, cold, rainy, miserable spring. Only in the last couple of weeks where the temperatures got up enough where my basement apartment was actually warm enough to proof bread effectively. If you can work in a warm kitchen, that's really going to help your bread proof and be a more manageable, malleable, soft, silky texture. You can make bread when it's colder in here. It will turn out fine. It'll still be perfectly edible and delicious and wonderful bread that you'll be happy you made. Once the balls have relaxed and expanded in the bowls, grease your loaf pans and turn out your balls of dough. Now gently roll each ball into a log. Move your hands out from the center as you roll. Once you have a log that is roughly the length of your loaf pan, cup your hands and gently pull the dough toward you. Keep your hands pressed firmly along the work surface so that the bread pulls taut across the top as it sticks to the counter. Turn the loaf around and pull it toward you again. Now transfer it to your loaf pan, seam side down. Repeat with the second loaf. Cover these again with a greased plastic wrap and preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 hour. Slashing the dough is just as important with these loaves as it was with the country loaf. I learned that the hard way. Multiple loaves blew out because I didn't slash deeply enough. To make slashing the dough a little easier in the loaf pan, I picked up a baker's lom, which is really just a stick with a razor blade at the end of it. But It lets me get the blade down into the pan much easier than trying to hold it with my fingers. It's also much safer. This is from Amazon, it's all steel and comes with a few blades. I'll have a link in the description. These loaves get a long slash across the top. I score each slash twice just to make sure it gets deep enough. Once the loaves have been scored, immediately transfer them to your oven for 25 minutes. Don't peek. If you open the oven door, you lose heat and you won't build the brown crust you want on top. There you go, that's how we make a different sort of bread using the exact same ingredients. While these cool, I'm gonna cut into this loaf that I baked a couple of days ago. Same exact process, just a few days old. Compared to our country loaf, this has a very thin, very soft crumb. It's really great for making small sandwiches, toast in the morning. This is great with eggs or really any sort of morning breakfast toast preparation you prefer. Of course, it's homemade bread, so it's gonna be good with butter. What's not to love? Be sure to join me next week because I'm going to show you how to make an absolutely baller roast beef in order to make sandwiches. Hey, thanks for watching. As always, please like and subscribe. It does help me out immensely. I also have a Patreon. Link is down below. You'll be able to go there, see what you can get, including early access to most of my videos, and I will have a few patron exclusives coming up soon. Thanks for checking it out, and I will see you next time.